For today's lecture, I'd like to mention my epic fantasy novel, Primitica Volume 1. You can read the completed second edition free, purchase a physical copy, or listen here on the channel to my full reading of the earlier manuscript as it went through editing. Everything is linked through the link tree below. Now, Aristotle's Topics, Book 7, gives commonplace rules for sameness, definition, and dialectical difficulty. Let me just zoom in on the board here and adjust that. There we go. So, Topics, Book 7. It's equal to commonplace rules for sameness, definition, and dialectical difficulty. Book 7 teaches that to test a definition, we must test whether the defining expression is really the same as the thing defined. It also explains why destroying a definition is much easier than proving one. A definition depends on sameness of essence. If the defining expression differs from the term in accidents, category, genus, differentia, degree, consequence, or in the possibility of separate existence, then it's not the same and cannot be the definition. But to establish a definition, one must prove the whole essence. So let's go ahead and move on to the first point here. From definition to sameness. Right, so Book 6 asked, okay, is this expression really the definition of S? Book 7 begins by asking, are these two things really the same? And that's not a random shift. A definition must be the same in meaning as the thing defined. So we have definition of S, and that is equal to expression signifying the essence of S therefore name corresponds with definition. At least that's the framework we're using. So to test a definition, test sameness between the term and the account. If the term and the account are not the same in content, there's no definition, right? So All right, so what is this sameness more rigorously? We'll discuss that in the next point. The strictest sense of sameness. So Aristotle says that the strictest sense of sameness is numerical sameness, right? Where you have same in the strictest sense being equivalent to numerically 1. So this is stronger than generic sameness or specific sameness. So let me write that out. Same genus is not equivalent to same species, which is not equivalent to same number. So let's get some examples going here. Socrates and Socrates. This is equivalent to numerically the same. Whoops. Numerically same. Socrates and Plato. This is equivalent to same species. Same species, but not numerically same. And man and horse is equivalent to same genus, not same species. So numerical sameness is the strongest kind of sameness. And so we always have to ask what kind of sameness is being claimed. Oops. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Why sameness matters for definition. So a definition must match the thing defined in the relevant strict way. It shouldn't merely be related to the thing, it mustn't merely resemble the thing, it mustn't merely belong to the same genus, it must state the same essence. All right, so definition. Definition as being equivalent to same essence expressed in speech. A definition is not just a true statement about a thing. It's the account of what the thing is. Definition requires sameness of essence, not mere association. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Test sameness through inflections and coordinates. So if two things are the same, their inflections and coordinates should line up. For example, if justice is equal to courage, then just man should be equal to brave man, and justly should be equal to bravely. Right, and we get this whole generalized pattern where we have, okay, A is equal to B, implies that the forms of A are equal to the forms of B. Now, sameness should survive across related grammatical forms. If the root terms are identical, their related forms should correspond. All right, let's move on to the next point. Test sameness through opposites. So if two things are the same, their opposites should also be the same. And we've seen this before, right? A equals B implies opposite. We've seen this sort of thing before. Opposite of A is equal to opposite of B. All right, so for example, if justice were the same as courage, then injustice and cowardice would have to line up in the corresponding way. Actually, I think I can put that on one line. Yep, there we go. So if two things are identical, their opposites must correspond. A mismatch among opposites reveals a mismatch among the original terms. Let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Test sameness through production and destruction. So, were things absolutely the same? Their formations and destruction should also be the same. Right, so A equals B implies formation of A is equivalent to formation of B. A equals B implies destruction of A is equal to destruction of B. Likewise, producer of A is equal to producer of B. And destroyer of A is equal to destroyer of B. Same thing should have the same sources and the same destructions. Different origins or destructions indicate difference in being. Let's go ahead and move on to the next point. The superlative test. So Aristotle considers cases where two things are called greatest, best, or most desirable. So Xenocrates, who's another philosopher, a Platonist actually, argued that the happy life and the good life are the same because both are the most desirable. So A is equal to most desirable. Let me just make this. A equals most desirable, B equals most desirable, And there's a question of whether it necessarily follows that A equals B. And the crux of it is only if A and B are numerically 1. So two things called best are not automatically identical unless the best is numerically 1. Shared superlative status does not by itself prove identity. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Class comparison does not prove identity. Oops. So Aristotle uses the example of Peloponnesians and Spartans. So suppose someone says Peloponnesians are the bravest Greeks. Right, and suppose it was also said Spartans are the bravest Greeks. Right, it doesn't necessarily follow that Peloponnesians are equivalent to Spartans. Rather, one class may be contained in another. The Spartans being a subset of Peloponnesians. So shared superiority does not prove identity of classes. Two classes may share a predicate because one is included in the other. Let's move on to the next point. Same as the same thing. So if one of two alleged identical things is the same as some third thing, the other must also be the same as that third thing. Right, so suppose A equals B, A equals C. Well, Therefore, B equals C. Right, and if this fails, then A is not equal to B. So things identical to each other must share identity relations to third things. Identity transfers through identity. Let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Test sameness through accidents. So if two things are the same, whatever belongs accidentally to one should belong accidentally to the other. A equals B implies accidents of A equal accidents of B. Likewise, whatever has one as an accident should have the other as an accident. So a discrepancy in accidents reveals difference. If an accident belongs to one but not the other, they are not the same. All right, let's move on to the next point. Test sameness through categories. So if one term signifies a quality and another signifies a quantity or relation, they are not the same. So if A is an element of quality, or a quality, and B is a quantity, well, therefore, A is not equal to B. So category mismatch refutes identity. Things in different categories cannot be numerically the same thing. Let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Test sameness through genus. So if the genera aren't the same. The things themselves are not the same. Genus of A not equal to genus of B implies A is not equal to B. For example, if A is a set of virtue and B is a subset, well, A is a subset of virtue and B is a subset of knowledge, and virtue and knowledge are different genera, then A and B are not simply the same. Right, so same thing should fall under the same genus. A false genus reveals false identity. Let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Test sameness through differentiate. Right, so even if the genus is the same, the differentiate must also match. So let's say you have same genus, the addition of different differentiae. Well, that implies not the same species. For example, two things may be both sciences. For example, let's say A is a science and so is B, but one may be speculative. So A is a speculative science whoops, I just realized I wrote something weird here. I wrote species, weird. Okay. Species. So A is a science and so is B, but A is a speculative science and B is a practical science. Right, if the differentiae differ, the things are not the same. So sameness requires agreement not only in genus, but also in differentiating marks. Same kind plus difference is not sameness. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Test sameness through degrees. So if one thing admits greater and less while the other does not, they are not the same. Also, if both admit degrees but do not intensify together, they're not the same. So roughly it's like, okay, A increases, it's a general pattern, but B does not increase. Therefore, A is not equal to B. For example, love and desire for intercourse are not the same. If someone can be more intensely in love without more intensely desiring intercourse. Okay. Yeah, okay. So, identical things should vary together in degree. Right? If two things do not increase and decrease together, they are not identical. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Test sameness through addition. Right, so if adding each alleged identical thing to the same thing does not produce the same whole, they aren't the same. Right, so if A equals B, that implies that X plus A is equal to X plus B. If X plus A is not equal to X plus B, then A is not equal to B. Identical things should behave the same under addition. Addition reveals whether the alleged equals really function alike. go ahead and move on to the next point. So this one follows from the previous one, right? I mean, as they all do, but test sameness through subtraction. So if subtracting the same thing from each expression leaves different remainders, the originals are not the same. All right, so if a is equal to b, that implies a minus x is equal to b minus x, and, well, if a minus x is not equal to b minus x, then a is not equal to b, right? Now, for example, let's consider double a half and multiple of a half. If we subtract a half from each, the remainders are double and multiple. And these do not signify the same thing. So if equal things lose the same part, the remainders should match. Subtraction can expose hidden difference. Let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Test by hypothetical consequences. So Aristotle says we shouldn't ask only whether an impossible consequence follows directly, but also whether a supposition reveals a difference. For example, some say empty is equivalent to full of air. But suppose the air is exhausted from the vessel. Then it's no longer full of air, but it becomes more empty, not less empty. So empty is not equal to full of air. Right, you remove air, full of air disappears, empty increases, therefore empty is not equal to full of air. So, let me just repair this, there we go, that's good enough. So, a hypothesis can expose difference by removing one predicate while preserving or increasing another. A good supposition separates what a bad definition confused. Oops. Let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Look for any discrepancy anywhere. So, Aristotle generalizes the method. If two things are the same, everything predicated of one should be predicated of the other. So, and also, whatever one is predicated of, the other should be predicated of it too. So, just write this down in notation. So, if A is equal to B, it implies for every P, we have P of A, well, PA corresponds with PB. And A equals to B implies for every X such that AX corresponds with BX. So identity requires complete predicational agreement. Every real difference in predication counts against identity. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Beware different senses of sameness. All right, so sameness is said, and we've discussed this a bit earlier, but sameness is said in several different ways. So numerically the same is different from specifically the same, which is different from generically the same. Things that are the same in one way are not necessarily the same in another. All right, same species does not imply same number. Same genus does not imply same species, and so on. Whoops. So, always ask, same in what sense? Sameness must be specified before it can be tested. Let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Can one exist without the other? So, a direct test of non-identity is separate existence. If one can exist without the other, they are not the same. A can exist without B implies A does not equal B. Identity requires inseparability in being. If A remains when B is removed, then, come on, A and B were never identical. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Why sameness matters for definition. So, Book 7 explicitly connects sameness to definition. If the expression and the term do not signify the same thing, the expression cannot be the definition. Term not equal to expression implies not definition. So, all destructive rules about sameness are useful against definitions. Every test of non-identity is a possible test against definition. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Constructive sameness is not enough for definition. Aristotle says the constructive rules about sameness do not by themselves establish a definition. Why? Because a definition must do more than signify the same thing. It must also state the essence, or state essence. Use genus and differentia correctly. Differentiate correctly. be peculiar, and be well-formed. So, sameness is necessary for definition, but it's not sufficient. A phrase may be coextensive with a term and still fail to define it. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Establishing a definition is possible but difficult. So Aristotle says few people in dialectical discussion actually reason their way to a definition. In geometry, arithmetic, and similar sciences, definitions are usually assumed as starting points. Still, Aristotle says it is possible to reason to a definition. Definition is equivalent to expression signifying essence. If we establish that only certain predicates are predicated in the category of essence, then the expression containing them must be the definition. A definition can be established only by securing the essential predicates. Definition requires strong premises about the essence. Well, about essence. Okay. Now let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Definition through genus and differentiate. Right, so to establish a definition, one must show that the proposed genus and differentiate are the only predicates in the category of essence, right? And we've talked about this at length before, but I'm going to go, and as usual, I just go point by point in the way that things are discussed within the book to lead to some conclusions and to point out certain things. So here, right, so only essence predicates, hyphen predicates, right? Essence predicates. Is equal to G plus D sub 1 plus D sub 2 plus onward, right? So genus plus differentia 1, differentia 2. Therefore, a definition, well, only essence predicates are equivalent to G plus D sub 1 plus G sub 2 plus on and on and on. So definition is equal to G plus D sub 1 plus D sub 2 plus on and on and on, right? So a successful definition captures all and only the essential structure. Definition is complete essence in ordered speech. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Establishing definitions through opposites. Just as a bit of a refresher, we're going to be going a little bit, well, I mean, Aristotle does the bit of the same. We've talked about this before. Reiteration, building new things, this overlapping thing to make sure we get what we should out of what he's saying. So Aristotle recommends examining contraries and other opposites. So if the definition of the contrary term is clear, the definition of the term before us may become clear, right? So definition of contrary implies a definition of the original. So the definition of one opposite can illuminate the definition of another. Opposition can be constructive as well as destructive. All right, let's go ahead and move on to another point. Oops. Contraries, genus, and differentiate. And quite frankly, going over similar things in Aristotle is also helpful to me as well because, you know, memory ain't a perfect thing, guys. I mean, it'd be nice. It'd be nice. But when using contraries, examine both genus and differentiate. Contrary things must be either in the same genus or in contrary genera. Their differentia must be either the same or contrary. So, contrary terms imply same / contrary genera and same. I think that should go the other way. / contrary differentiation. So, contrary definition should preserve the structure of genus and differentia. So, definitions of opposite should be structurally opposed or coordinated. Go ahead and move on to the next point. All right, so we've seen this before in inflections. Well, use inflections and coordinates to establish definition. Right, and to the subject matter, forgetfulness, well, definition should correspond through inflections and coordinates. And for example, related example, forgetfulness is, like if you said that this is equivalent to loss of knowledge, then to forget would be equal to lose knowledge, and to have forgotten would be the same as to have lost knowledge, right? So right, if one grammatical form is defined, the other should follow. A definition should travel through the family of related expressions. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Use analogous relations. So definitions may be tested through like relations. Again, it's something we've seen before. So for example, if you said, okay, healthy is equal to productive health, then perhaps vigorous is equal to productive of rigor. Well, sorry, I meant productive of health. Yeah, let's suppose you said healthy is equal to productive of health. Then vigorous would be maybe productive, maybe equivalent to productive of vigor. And useful would be equivalent to productive of use, right? So right? A corresponds with B is equivalent to the C corresponds with D. So analogous relations can support analogous definitions. Analogy gives pressure, not automatic proof, though. Let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Right. Use greater and lesser degrees, and we've seen this. Well, greater and like degrees. So Aristotle says definitions can be tested. Definitions can be tested through greater and like degrees. If A defines if A defines A, well, if capital A defines little a better than capital B defines little b, and B really defines B, then A may define A. Oops. So, come on. Or if A's claim is to define little a is like B's claim to define B, and B succeeds, A may succeed as well. So, comparative plausibility can support definitions just as it supports genus and property claims. More and less reasoning, more and less reasoning can guide definitional argument. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Limits of greater and less in definition. So yes, a lot of this lecture, as you've noticed, is just basically a review of what exactly we were discussing with definitions in the previous book, but nevertheless, we continue to get more clarity. So Aristotle warns that these comparisons do not work when one definition is being compared with two things, or two definitions with one thing. And, well, why is this? Well, because one thing cannot have two definitions in the strict sense, and two different things cannot have one definition in the strict sense. So let me just write this down. Right, and if they did, well, I mean, it would just be the same, right? So let me just, come on. And there. So definition is tied to one essence, one definition. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next point. The most useful commonplace, or commonplaces. So, yep. So Aristotle says the handiest commonplaces are those of the form coordinates and inflections as they are useful in the greatest number of occasions. He praises... Come on. See, this is what happens when I try to write and speak at the same time. Okay. He also praises rules of wide general application, such as examining individual cases and then species. We've seen that before, right? So, individuals, species, general test, right? The most useful rules are those that apply broadly and quickly. As we've seen before, the dialectician should keep the most general tools ready to hand. All right, on to the next point. General rules remain valuable. So Aristotle says we should use other general rules. Right, like check individual cases, check the species, continue to watch for metaphor, watch for self-predication. Broad diagnostic rules are the dialectician's ready weapons. General rules are useful because they produce many lines of attack. Yeah, and we get into some things which are a little more than review here in a moment. But yes, on this next point, we address another similar thing in memory, which is establishing a definition is harder than overthrowing one. All right. And Aristotle gives a major methodological claim. Whenever he states this, right, it is harder to establish a definition than to overthrow one, right? Because, well, to overthrow, you only really got to find one failure. to establish you got to prove all the conditions. It's asking for more. So destruction needs one crack, construction needs the whole structure. A definition is harder to build than to break. All right, on to the next point. Establishing definition requires many premises. So to establish To establish a definition, we must secure claims such as this is the genus. These are the differentiae. These alone are predicated in essence. The account is peculiar. And the account is convertible. So definition requires a complete account of essence, not a single successful predicate, right? So dialecticians often assume definitions because proving them is so demanding. Let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Overthrowing, and this all goes into like the sameness of it all, but overthrowing definition requires only one failure. Right, so a definition can be demolished if the formula fails to apply to one instance, or the formula applies beyond the term, or the genus is wrong, or one differentiae is wrong, or it fails to state essence, right? So one failed part. Implies definition demolished. A definition is vulnerable at every term. It contains every element of a definition is a point of attack. All right, let's move on to the next point. Universal proof and particular refutation. So to establish a definition, the reasoning must be universal. The definition must apply to everything of which the term is predicated and must be convertible, right? So for every x such that we have Sx corresponds with dx, right? But to demolish the definition, yeah. It is enough to show one counterexample, right? There exists x such that Sx and not dx, right? Or there exists x such that dx and not Sx, right? So universal construction is harder than particular destruction, right? So to prove definition, prove all. To refute it, find one failure. Now we go on to a chart that's a bit new here, so let's go ahead and move on to that. Oof, come on. Definition, property, genus, and accident compared. Now we get into some of the more new stuff. So Aristotle compares the difficulty of establishing and demolishing different predicables. And I can make a handy chart for it. So, okay, I'm just gonna write this down. Predicable definition. Property. Oh man, I may be running out of room. Come on. I need a new marker. Predicable is being definite. This being either definition, property, genus, or accident. Let's do this. There we go. And let's rate this on establishing. So for establishing definition, well, this will be the hardest. For establishing property, that's hard. For establishing genus, that's moderately hard. And for establishing accident, well, this is the easiest to establish. How about overthrowing or demolishing? Well, for definition, that's the easiest. For property, that's fairly easy. For genus, that's easier. And accident is hardest to overthrow, right? And this all makes sense. So, let me just, come on. Overthrow. Right, so the stricter the predicable, the easier it is to attack and the harder it is to prove. Greater structure gives more points of failure. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Property is close to definition. So a property is near definition because it also, well, it's also convertible with the subject, but it doesn't state the essence. Right, so definition, we've seen this before, but yeah. Convertible plus essence. Property is equal to convertible plus non-essential. Property is hard to establish because one must show belongs to all and belongs only to the subject. Property is almost as demanding as definition, except that it doesn't state essence. Property shares convertibility with definition, but not essentiality. Oops. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Genus is easier to overthrow than establish. Justifications going back to the chart, so let's do that. So to establish a genus, one must show not only that the predicate belongs, but that it belongs as genus. So to overthrow it, one must either show it never belongs or it fails in one case. Right, so establish genus is equivalent to show belongs as genus. Right, and overthrow genus is equivalent to show failure to belong. Right, so belonging is not enough for genus. It must belong in the right way. A genus must be established as genus, but can be refuted by non-belonging. we go. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Accident is easiest to establish and hardest to overthrow. Right. Other side, directly on the other side of the chart from definition was accident. So an accident is easiest to establish because one only needs to show that it belongs, right? So accident established you only want to show predicate belongs. Right, but it's hard to overthrow because the speaker has not said that it belongs as essence, genus, or property. There are fewer handles to attack. Right, and you're not really responsible for that. It's just, well, this is accidental, so yeah. And you can see what that means. I mean, just even colloquially. Come on. So accident gives the least structure and therefore the least attack. The looser the claim, the harder it is to refute. Well, it's there because of this. No, actually, I meant this. No, well, you know, who really knows? Anyhow, on to the next point. Universal and particular accident. So, universal accident. So, okay. Aristotle also notes a difference between universal and particular accidental predication. So, in the case of the universal accident, we have every S is P, and this is hard to establish. And easy to demolish. You could say overthrow as well. I'm gonna say demolish because it ends with ish. Right, prove all, refute one. And for the particular accident, that's sum S is P. Now this is easy to establish and whenever I say this is relative to like what exactly a accident is, relative to each other, right? Relative to each other. Because, I mean, even just going at this, it's like, well, I mean, a definition's always going to be, well, it's usually going to be, should be harder, right? So, this is easy to establish, hard to overthrow. Hard to demolish, I mean. I wrote it in my notes as overthrow, but I'm going to use demolish. So, prove one. Refute all. Right, so difficulty depends not only on predicable but on quantity, universal, and particular claims reverse the burden of proof. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Why definition, in case you haven't seen it more clearly before, we're going to go ahead and address this a bit more here. Why definition is easiest to demolish. A definition contains many parts, right? And we've discussed this. Genus, differentiae, peculiarity, convertibility, and you see this with like a lot of machines. Well, I mean, if you have a machine that consists of a bunch of parts, well, you're more likely to run into failure. I was just looking at like a case of like, I was just looking at like documentaries on German tanks, and it was like, well, this thing was very complex, and because of that, it failed a lot. But each point, a potential failure. Right, so the more a statement claims, the more ways it can fail. Definition claims the most. Therefore, it is easiest to attack. Oh, come on. Okay, now let's go ahead and move on to the next point. Which again is just strengthening previously made points. So why definition is hardest to establish. Right, so to establish a definition, one must show, well, the attribute belongs. The genus is true. The differentiae are true. Formula is peculiar. The formula indicates essence. And that the whole account is correct. And even, it's like, well, what does correctness mean? Is it consistency? Not going to get too much into that for now, but to prove a definition, one must prove the whole essence is the point. So definition requires the fullest dialectical burden. Whoops. Okay, come on. There we go. It's supposed to be a U. Okay. Now let's get into the final 2 points to wrap this thing up. So this is where I discuss the architecture of this book. So the architecture of Book 7 So book 7 moves through the following arc. You go sameness and difference, then to inflections, coordinates and opposites, then to production and destruction, then to superlatives and class identity, then to accidents, categories, genus, differentiate, then to degrees, addition, subtraction, then to existence without the other, then to sameness as a test for definition, then to constructing definitions, then to opposites and analogy, then to useful commonplaces, then to why definition is hardest to establish and easiest to overthrow, then to comparison of definition, property, genus, and accident. And, some repetition there. But book 7 shows why definition is dialectically fragile, right? Definition depends on the sameness of essence, of essence. And sameness is easy to disrupt. All right, now let's move on to the summary. Summary of main ideas. Book 7 begins with sameness and difference because definition requires sameness between the term and the account. The strictest sense of sameness is numerical sameness. Sameness can be tested through inflections, coordinates, and opposites. Same things should have the same formations, destructions, producers, and destroyers. Two things called greatest or most desirable are not automatically identical unless the superlative identifies something numerically one. Shared class superiority does not prove identity. Things identical with one another should be identical with the same third thing. Same things should share accidents. Category mismatch refutes identity. Same things should have the same genus. Same things should have same things should have the same differentiate. Identical things should vary in degree. It should vary together in degree. Addition and subtraction can expose non-identity. Hypothetical consequences can reveal the two alleged identical things come apart. So, and then next after that, we discussed identity requires complete predicational agreement. Sameness is said in several senses, so we must ask what kind of sameness is being claimed. If one thing can exist without another, they are not the same. Destructive rules about sameness are useful against definitions. Constructive sameness is necessary but not sufficient for definition. A definition can be established only by securing the predicates predicated in the category of essence. A definition is built from genus and differentiae. Opposites, inflections, coordinates, and analogies help in testing and establishing definitions. The most useful commonplaces are those that apply broadly and quickly. It is harder to establish a definition than to overthrow one. To overthrow a definition, one defect is enough. To establish a definition, one must prove all the necessary features. The stricter the predicable, the easier it is to attack, and harder it is to prove. Definition is easiest to demolish and hardest to establish. Accident is easiest to establish and hardest to demolish. Property is close to definition because it is convertible, but it doesn't state essence. So, in the final framing of this, topics, topics, book 7 teaches that definitions depend on sameness of essence, and that the stricter a claim is, the easier it is to attack. Furthermore, Book 7 shows why definition is dialectically fragile. If the defining expression differs from the term in accidents, category, genus, differential, degree, consequence, or possibility of separate existence, then it is not the same and cannot be the definition. But to establish a definition, one must prove the whole definition. So, again, I say definitions are hardest to build and easiest to destroy. And I'll leave it at that. That is it for this lecture, and I will see you in the next one.